And salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are super excited, as always, to welcome back author and healer Peter Mark Adams to chat about his latest tome, The Power of the Healing Field. And I know that many listeners, you're familiar with the terms energy and healing and intuition and consciousness and new age and reductive materialism. And all these terms tend to get thrown around a lot these days. But what do these terms actually mean? And how does tapping into different states of consciousness actually allow us to heal on various timelines for ourselves and also to heal others? Well, the perfect person to ask today is our return guest, Peter Mark Adams. And Peter, as I know many of you know, is an author, a poet, an essayist, and also, for many, many years, a professional energy worker, specializing in ethnography and the visuality of ritual in the history of art and sacred landscapes, esotericism, consciousness, and healing. And his latest tome, The Power of the Healing Field, comes from years of Peter's direct experience with healing and also with the experiences of his wife, life partner, and healer, Kenzie. And so we are so thankful for Peter's time today, as we were when he first stopped by to discuss the game of Saturn and the Sola Busca Taroki on the podcast. And I also want to thank each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your support of the podcast and just for your excellent questions for Peter, which we look forward to getting into. And Peter Mark Adams, thank you so much for taking the time and returning back on the Glitch Bottle podcast today. It is such an honor.
Hi, thank you, Alex. Delighted to be back with you. Looking forward to today's chat. Let's see how we go. Huh?
I think because you're here, it'll go very, very well. And, Peter, The Power of the Healing Field, it is a tour de force. You break down these amazing terms. You discuss what healing actually is. Now, you and as you mentioned, your wife and healer Kenzie have been doing this for years. What was the genesis of you saying, "Hey, it's time to put this together into an actual collection of research and personal experience"? What was the driving factor?
Well, first version of this book was actually about 2014. And then it was kind of just left on the shelf. And subsequently, because of the interest that inner traditions took in it, I decided to pick it up again and thoroughly revise it from end to end, update the cases, update the framework. And it seemed to be an appropriate response to these unprecedented times in which we find ourselves. The pandemic has been unprecedented in my lifetime, possibly in the last century. And it's by no means over. We don't know how this thing is going to continue to evolve in the coming years. So that was one driver, really. The pandemic has been a kind of an emotional challenge on so many levels, I think, in terms of isolation, fear, and all those negative feelings that generate the cortisol that, like a vicious circle, tends to generate even lower levels of immune functioning. So it seemed like a perfect time to bring this book out and to open up this topic of healing, which I felt was so little known about, certainly in esoteric circles, and amongst the wider public. Despite the fact that many of the techniques we're working with have been around for 30, 40 years, it amazes me that, there's so little known about, so little heard about. The other driver was that we've had so many incredible cases of healing, and just in themselves, they should be better known about, because they point us towards a far more expansive view of who we are and what our potential is than day-to-day life normally gives us indication of. And finally, of course, we're now living under the shadow of nuclear war once more, which we thought had gone away. But hey, we're back there. So Stress is a psychophysical challenge to the immune system. And if there's anything that we can do ourselves to empower ourselves to improve our immune system and deal with stress, then I hope this book will serve that purpose.
Absolutely. And that's why, to myself as well, and I know many of the listeners, this book is so important because it touches on themes that are timeless and exercises and ways to tap into this deep architecture that's within us to help heal ourselves and others. But it's also incredibly timely as well with everything you've just delineated too, Peter. And can you help us break the dichotomy? If you'll permit me, I will set up a very basic straw man, but it seems that there is this kind of dichotomy where, as you said, esotericists might dismiss this whole energy consciousness thing as, oh, that's new agey and that has nothing to do with esotericism and magic. And then on the other side, you have people who perhaps are all in on this stuff, but they might not define the terms. They might not fully explain things. So, but betwixt these two dichotomies, can you kind of share with us about what is healing? What does consciousness actually mean? What are some of the main themes that you touch on in your book?
Yeah, perhaps we can start with energy itself. That is one of the most polysemous of words. We use it in so many different contexts. But what I'm interested in is in the context of healing. Okay, so the first use of concept of energy in the healing context is subtle energy, chi or ki energy, and all those related terms like energy anatomy, energy body, light body, the meridians, the energy channels, and so on. And this language has incredibly ancient roots. I mean, in the book, I talk about the example of this Neolithic figure that emerged from the Alpine ice, Ötzi he's called, whose tattoos correspond with the acupuncture points that would need to be treated for the conditions his body was diagnosed as suffering from. So that for me was just mind-blowing, that there should be a system of sophisticated acupuncture in Neolithic Europe. It is absolutely incredible. We can look at the Hellenistic vocabulary, the ogoides, the radiant body, or astroides, the sidereal body, and realize that there's a huge cultural continuum in the human experience with the natural energy bodies that we all have, okay? Connected with that is the concept of energy healing. Now, we know that every organ and part of the body generates an electromagnetic field in the extremely low frequency range. That's to say between 0.5 and 80 hertz or cycles per second. So that when we do, for instance, hands-on healing, we know the healer is generating a wave that fluctuates through that range of frequencies, the frequencies that correspond to the frequencies natural to the human body, and indeed to animal bodies as well, not just humans. But in experienced healers, the amplitude of the wave can be up to 1,000 times greater. So that, there's a natural healing effect. So this is a second use of the word energy, healing energy within this context. So moving from energy, we may want to start thinking about awareness, for instance. This is, connecting energy and consciousness together now. So in the context of healing, awareness is the immediate luminous experience of the present. And it's shared by all sentient life forms. But it's a bit like a torch light. That's to say, its focus and what it illuminates is variable. So we can shift our awareness. We can shift the quality and depth of our awareness to illuminate aspects of reality that are not normally visible to us. Okay. And that provides access to a larger, non-local, atemporal field of consciousness that we're going to have to talk about shortly. Okay. Another key term following on from that is intuition. Okay. Psi, the sense of impending events and of their underlying veracity, which arises when our awareness shifts to a more open, receptive mode of operation. So I'd like to just quickly illustrate that if I could, Alex. I'll just share a slide with you if I could. Sorry, this always takes a little time to do. There we go. And what I wanted to illustrate with this slide is that from the very apex of this upside down triangle, which is our present moment, rational, calculative awareness, our awareness spreads out behind us into far more dynamic and open levels in which we're able to pick up information that's normally occluded in day-to-day life. So that most of us have already grasped with instinctive awareness, for instance, that sudden sense of danger or of something wrong in the environment. Okay. Beyond that are states of intuitive awareness, where we start to, as I said, pick up on aspects of our environment which are not apparent at all. And this includes, for instance, thinking of someone only to have them call you a short while later. It's a very common experience, okay? Or you bump into them on the street unexpectedly, you know? So there's like a wave of information which precedes their appearance. We pick up something and then it's actualized. And from that, we can move to states of empathic awareness where we directly tap into the thoughts and feelings of others, whether people or animals or plants, trees. And it's in this mode between intuitive and empathic awareness that most healers, most successful professional healers operate, okay? Beyond that, there's what I've called psychic awareness, which is the ability to pick up from the field childhood hurts or familial disturbances that the person is no longer conscious of having had as part of their biographical timeline. Okay, so this yellow area is very much the area of energy healers operation. Okay, and as you work as an energy healer, you develop these qualities to a higher level. They're very often non-verbal, they're very often direct, pictorial, or symbolic information transfers. And it raises the larger question of where that information is held. Okay, so that's kind of the learning point here. Where's the information held for us to pick up? Okay, it must be held somewhere. And I want to say that it's held in the larger field of consciousness. Okay, so let me just come back out of this slide if I could. And so I'd like to talk about the field a little because it's kind of central to the healing process. We can consider the field in terms of energy healing under two different headings or aspects, the universal field and local fields, okay? The universal field is also called traditionally things like the astral plane or the Akashic field. I think it was picked up from Vedanta by the early theosophists. And it appears in Sri Aurobindo's work as the supermind, Ervin Laszlo's A field, which is the Akashic field again. He's using the old theosophical term. Albrecht Moore works in constellation therapy, calls it the knowing field. And Rupert Sheldrake has called it the morphic field. I've called it the healing field because that's the particular aspect of it that I want to focus in on.
Peter, that is so wonderful. And I was truly, your book forced me to consider so many different things that I hadn't even been aware of or considering before. So for example, you mentioned this tremendous healing that you experienced from an enlarged liver.
Yeah.
Could you share about what that experience illuminates about the relationship between healing and awareness? Because some listeners might, I think, really have similar experiences, or they might really resonate with that.
Yeah. What had happened is that I went along to acupuncturist and I had a diagnosis, and he'd spoken about you have this enlarged liver, and that we can work on that over the course of 6 to 8 months with acupuncture, you know. And shortly after that diagnosis, before I started the acupuncture sessions, we met, Kenzie and I met up with an energy healer, a Russian bioenergist who just arrived. And she met up with us, and she said, I'll demonstrate what I can do to you. And so she quickly ran her hands over my aura and immediately said, okay, you've got a large liver. You know, she just picked that up immediately and said, yeah, I know how to treat that. So I said, okay, I'm definitely game for this. And what happened subsequently is kind of extraordinary. She kind of brought together her own inner energy. None of these phrases are going to make sense from a logical perspective, but she kind of collected her inner energy. And then she massaged the liver briefly. And then using her mouth, she drew into herself the blocked energy around the liver. And it transformed her face with the underlying emotions that were connected with this. That mixture of sadness and anger must be from very early childhood. And in a second, then she just lifted her head up and blew everything out. And instantaneously, I had this surge of energy through my body and entered a state of kind of non-dual ecstatic awareness. It was like just thrown into a satori there and then. I was in kind of joyous laughter for half an hour with the ecstasy of this experience. So a few days later, we went back to the acupuncturist and he did the diagnosis again, before starting treatment. And he says, I can't find any trace of it whatsoever. So there you go. There was a real high quality energy healer at work, using all of the things I've been talking about now: inner energy, sensing the field, picking up on that one emotional element that was the blockage, and having the compassion and big-heartedness to just take that into herself and then release it. What an incredible experience that was.
I know myself, Peter, and I'm sure many listeners are resonating with the elements or some of the elements of that, because as I know we've discussed on the podcast many times before, esotericism in general, instead of operating on the laws of physics, it operates on the laws of meaning and of healing, and on an entirely different plane. And one of the things that you take aim at in the book, Peter, is you basically make the case that, hey, this stuff in history, thousands and thousands of years ago, was very widely practiced, these techniques. But you take aim at effectively modern humans and our bondage to reductive materialism. Can you share about what is reductive materialism, and even for esotericists and for people listening, what are some of the pitfalls of falling into this fetishizing of reductive materialism?
Okay. I mean, I perceive it as an outcome of a mechanistic explanatory framework. Okay. It long predates the Enlightenment. It's not something that just came into being with the Enlightenment. You can go all the way back to Democritus and there's atomic theory. And so there's a certain form of explanatory framework within the human cultural evolution. Okay, but it wasn't until the 17th century, I would say, that the mechanistic explanatory framework came to the front and started edging out other ways of relating to reality. Okay, so it directly generated what we call the scientific revolution of the 17th century. And that preceded and enabled the industrial revolution of the 18th century. It was only with the industrialization of European culture that we lost the older ways of connecting with nature. Okay, so it was a huge narrowing of what was accepted as a source of knowledge, of a reciprocity with the environment and with nature. So I see that as a direct outcome of industrialization. So in other words, the technological revolution that occurred in human development turned into an industrial revolution that has never ceased since then. And the problem is that we lost balance. The current decades are an attempt to rebalance ourselves as we realize that our lack of connectivity with nature is now endangering the planet. Okay, we need a rebalance. So, for instance, from a shareholder value view of economics and business, we need to move to a stakeholder value, and not just in the corporate brochure. We actually have to make that transition now. Okay, so that is kind of, for me, one of the signal events that the current decades have got to engineer. More and more corporations have got to drop their underlying belief in shareholder value, and that will take a social and economic and business revolution. But unless the generations coming into business now, coming out of business school, start engaging with this notion of shareholder value and start moving their companies out of this selfish predation of natural resources to plow the profits back into an increasingly small group of people, then there's not going to be any hope for environmental rebalancing. Okay. So the stakeholder view of business has got to come to the fore at this time. I don't know. I mean, I'm too old for all this stuff, but I see it as the task for coming generations, people coming out of business school, economics, and so on. The notion of stakeholder value and the fact that the environment is not an externality in your accounting books, okay? It's not an externality. It's where we're all living and breathing and drinking the water and growing our food and everything else. So I think that this shift to the shift of the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, colored European mercantile and imperial ventures. And through that, so through those channels, better to say, it's kind of spread everywhere, so we see, massive decimation of Amazon rainforests and so on and so forth, Indonesian forests getting chopped down for wood, mining companies are running amok. So we're literally driving ourselves to the point of extinction. That's my feeling. And we need to find a way of reversing the priorities.
And so, Peter, just to your exact point, there were so many refreshing and rejuvenating things about your book, but really calling attention to this moment, because all of those issues that you just sketched out, and correct me if I'm wrong and tell me if this is a fair apprehension, is all of these things, the environment, politics, social engagement, structures, systems, the physicality, this kind of Malthusian coil that we find ourselves in. All of these things are truly they are the healing field. They are deep, deep areas that we may think of the ocean as just the ocean, just a body of water. But what you're saying is, no, this is a deep, deep, powerful elemental system. This is a powerful field that you can tap into. Is that somewhat fair?
Yeah. Let me give you another story, because this is how I was made aware of it in a way in which I could no longer, avoid. I went along to experience a thing called family constellation therapy. Okay. I didn't know about it. And I arrived there, and there's like this group of people who don't know each other. There's the therapist. And she was a pretty dynamic woman, a Jungian psychologist, and also very shamanically oriented, high energy person. And there were 3 or 4 people who wanted to actually get the therapy. So what then transpired was so amazing for me. One of these people who wants the therapy starts selecting people from this group of anonymous, observing participants, of which I was a member, to represent key members of their family, and placing them in the middle of the room, like, could you be my father or mother, brother, sister, uncle, grandfather, whatever, placing them in the middle of the room to represent the dynamics of that family as they perceived it. So some people are close together, some are far apart, some are looking away from each other. And then the person who wants the therapy just sits down. They don't take part in what is going to happen. Now, I was selected for one of these constellations. I was standing there, and all the people were put in place around me. This was the family constellation. This is the symbolic representation of the family. And immediately, I felt an emotional overlay. That's to say, I was fully and completely aware of myself, my thoughts, my feelings, but I suddenly had access to an overlay of thoughts, feelings, and sensations that were not my own. Okay. And as the therapist comes round and asks you about them, you're actually picking up the field of that person, even if that person is long dead and gone. Doesn't matter. And again, it raises the question, where is this information held? It can only be held in a non-local, atemporal, information-bearing field. Okay? And the extraordinary thing is that finding a conflict even in the ancestral past, it's possible for the therapist to resolve it. So effectively, what they're doing is decoding the field, resolving its inattentions, and recoding the field as a more harmonious pattern. Okay, that's what the constellation therapy is doing. And the amazing thing is, the reconciliation between people is fundamentally an ethical reconciliation. In other words, the field is an ethical field.
I cannot wait to dive into that because, well, let's just do it, Peter, because frankly, this is one of the most amazing things about your book is you really empower people to recode, as you say, their own healing fields. And it's even silly to say their own because it's really, we're tapping into this large shared field. So can you talk about recoding and just also maybe some of the basic concepts when it comes to the process of, basic healing exercises and things like that you sketch out in the book?
Let me share another slide with you if I could. Which
absolutely
just helps me to explain what
absolutely. And for those listeners who are just listening on the podcast, we will make sure to provide the different slides that Peter's sharing on the video.
Okay, so normally we think of our timeline, our biographical timeline, as present moment, biographical memory, and the biographical unconscious. And that's it, full stop, okay? That's the mainstream view of our timeline. But it is absolutely crystal clear from thousands of cases of healing that our timeline goes way beyond the biographical unconscious. It includes what I've called there perinatal memory, okay? And that's the memory of our time in the womb and of our birth process. And kind of contemporary medicine says, well, it's not possible because the brain isn't formed, and so you couldn't have conscious memory from that period. But we do have conscious memory from that period. And that means the brain is not the generator of consciousness, it is the receiver of consciousness. And there's enough consciousness there for us to be fully aware of what's happening in the womb, okay? As testified through various healing modalities, most prominently, of course, rebirthing breathwork kind of focuses on that area, okay? Beyond perinatal memory, we tend to fall into memories of past lives, and more specifically into memories of traumatic deaths in past lives, which actually brings forward one very important lesson. The manner of our death is important. Our ability to come to terms with death and dying, with the process, and with letting go, is important for the harmony of our own part of the collective, the bit of it that pertains to us. And beyond our own memories of past lives and of traumatic deaths especially, we enter the area of what I've called collective fields of consciousness. That's to say family memory, which I've given the example of the constellation therapy manages to bring together. And beyond that, ancestral memory. And beyond that, what I've called the universal field. So this is a continuum. And you can think of these different layers as the ones which are to the fore during energy healing. I'm not saying that the field of consciousness is structured like this. I'm saying that when you're working with energy healing modalities, these are the types of layering that you encounter. Okay, that's what I know. I hope that is helpful anyway.
That's very helpful, Peter. And I remember when you were on chatting about the game of Saturn and the Solabuska Taroki, one of the phrases that's in some of the cards is being driven by fate, trahor fetus. And
Yes.
yet this seems to be the opposite, because whereas someone might say, well, there's certain fate patterns and there's certain things. And of course, when you consider astrology and constellatory accentuations, of course, but what you're saying is this is a deeply empowering set of tools and set of engagements with the healing field that you can actually go back and change what you might perceive to be some kind of fate, but it's actually recoding your own reality. Would that be somewhat accurate?
Absolutely. And this was as true in the past as it is today. Constellation therapy evolved from traditional African healing practices. Okay. The trahor fat is from the Solabuska, this dominance of Haimarmin or fate, necessity, is challenged by theurgy. By overcoming the traces, the theurgic traces, the elements that hold us in thrall to the past, theurgy liberates us from that. So that Platon or George Gemistus clearly distinguished those who were under the, so to speak, weight of necessity and those who had liberated themselves from it. And the path to that liberation was through theurgy, through the cleansing, purification of the various vehicles and the dedication to a deity so that you get the assistance of a deity in your theurgic ascent towards non-dual awareness. And from that non-dual awareness, you engineer rebirths for the purpose of service. Okay, and it's this then becomes a positive rather than negative cycle of deliberately accepting rebirth to provide specific evolutionary spiritual services to humanity. Okay. Now, all of this is going to come up in a big way in a forthcoming work of mine. So I don't want to, we may talk about that later a little.
Absolutely. We will keep our ear to the ground on any updates on that, Peter. But Peter, speaking of challenging reality, I would love to kind of look at some of the misconceptions around this whole study, this whole field, if you will, pun fully intended, of energy healing. And there seems to be things that esotericists might have misconceptions of, and then people who might have misconceptions of the term New Age. So why don't we start with esotericists? Say you have a lot of people who are listening who are astrologers, ceremonial magicians, grimoire traditionalists. Well, we have a listener question for you from Douglas of What Magic Is This? And Douglas is asking and saying, I'm very intrigued about this chat with Peter. I was wondering Peter's thoughts as to what he thinks about how the term energy, quote unquote, is one of the most involved in magic, but it's also one of the most that people might turn their nose up at. So can you just, for all the esotericists listening, what would you like to remind them about with energy?
Okay. I don't want to offend anyone here, okay? I'm just trying to speak my thoughts, good or bad, right or wrong. So magic is typically and routinely described as causing change in conformity with will. Let me say right off that I do not accept that. I think it's vague, bland, and it means everything is magic, so it takes the meaning away from the word. So let me rephrase that classic expression. Magic is causing non-local change in conformity to will. Okay, that's something different. That's magic. Okay, so I just want to put that up there first. If it's not non-local change that you're causing, then it isn't magic. Okay, so how do we access this domain of magic? From a healing perspective, all of the work we do in distant healing the past, and this will be strange to some people, healing the future, okay, because we're now working in a non-local, atemporal field in which everything that was, is, and ever will be is, in a sense, already present, okay? So we are working non-locally as a fundamental or basic operation of energy healing work. It is not something alien to what we do. It is fundamental. And I'll go on to talk a little bit about why tapping EFT is so important. And let me just explain that while I'm on it. The reason I say that is that although it seems to have been superseded by other systems, tapping EFT remains the fastest, easiest, most effective entry into energy healing that you can find. And it takes you from tapping a present emotional disturbance that you have to helping someone else to overcome, to tapping on behalf of someone, surrogate tapping. How does that work? You tap yourself for somebody else's emotional disturbance, and it works. You tap yourself for somebody's emotional disturbance who's on the other side of the planet, and that also works. You imagine you're tapping yourself for someone else on the other side of the planet, and it also works. And then you don't bother tapping, and that also works. Okay, so energy healing is a domain of magic. Okay, it operates because your internal energy is sufficiently integrated together to allow your awareness to shift within the spectrum of awareness and to access the non-local atemporal qualities of the field. And it's in the field that you affect the change. Okay, the technique is simply a mechanism to get you out of your, sitting watching TV mode of consciousness into a more proactive, engaged, empathic, or psychic mode of awareness. And it's in that mode of awareness you enter the non-local and atemporal field of consciousness and affect change there. And in fact, this has kind of always been the case in magic. Like one of the first things a magical group does is to build up an egregore. That's to say a symbolic representation of itself and its context in the field of consciousness. And then through the egregore, it's possible to make, for instance, in the higher yoga tantra, contact with higher order beings. Because they're higher order beings, they're on a vibrational level beyond our ability to conceptualize and visualize, okay? But by building an egregoric framework, that allows those beings to interface with us, should they so choose. And that is also one of the essential elements of theurgic practice, okay? You're working in an atemporal, non-local field, but you can structure it in such a way that it works as an interface to that field. And that's very much what constellation therapy is doing. There's no need to put everyone in position, but by doing so generates a local field in which the larger field is meshed with it. And that allows us, again, it affords us an interface to then go in and decode and recode the field in a more harmonious way. Isn't what I'm talking about pure magic? Well, I mean, just because we call it energy healing, doesn't mean this is real magic. This is stuff you can start doing tomorrow. It doesn't require ritual apparatus. It doesn't require all these, clothing and implements, doesn't require volumes of grimoires. And it's straight in. It's environmentally and ethically improving. This is like, if we go back in time, and I'd like to share another slide with you because it's kind of relevant at this stage, I think. Okay, let me just share this with you because it just helped me explain these complex ideas a bit more clearly. Okay, what I want to say, I did this slide years ago, and then I was looking around the other day and I suddenly realized it may be relevant. I was trying to define what are the typical things that shaman do across the world. And I kind of figured out they work as diviners, healers, intermediaries between worlds, sorcerers, and seers. So when I looked at this, the kind of concrete activities in each of those larger categories, 80% of them are to do with community healing. Okay, now this is the foundation of magic here, back in the Paleolithic, and for how many thousands of years, from 40,000 BC or something right up to today, this was the foundation of modern magic, And most of it, 80% of it, is to do with community healing. Okay, so I think we kind of lost focus on that in recent years. Like magic has gone off in another direction. It's been influenced by television, media, cinema. It's been influenced by fashion, to be honest. But this is like ground zero. This should be our touchstone in our practice. We should look at this and say, okay, which parts of this kind of ancestral mapping of our community engagement do I actually do and do effectively? Okay. And
that is so lovely.
By engaging in energy healing, you'll find that you start to tick most of these boxes very quickly. Okay. Okay, let me just come out of this. Yes, there we are. Okay, we're back again.
Absolutely, Pete. Well, and Peter, as you mentioned too, this is an ethical engagement. When you talk about service to others, when you talk about this, very ancient, I mean, deeply ingrained drive for those in the shamanic community for communal healing, for individual healing, for helping those. What are some of the ways that, for those listening, Peter, myself included, and you sketch this out in the book, of course, in far greater detail, is to break those, as William Blake says, those mind-forged manacles of tethering ourselves to reductive materialism and of escaping those traps of, instead of engaging with the healing field, people might be obsessed with cultivating a spooky occult aesthetic or fetishizing some aspect of that takes away from the work. What are some of the things that you'd recommend people can do to kind of shake their own trees, so to speak, and really engage in that deep work, that meaningful work?
Okay. Let me just kind of freely respond to that, because it's a vast issue. So first thing is, when we think about healing, we need to remember the body is naturally a self-healing organism, okay? So it takes something for it to be in a state of imbalance, okay? Emotional issues are possibly one of the biggest contributors to imbalance. And certainly what are today called adverse childhood experiences, okay? And you can check that phrase up, Google it. It's a very productive area to look at, because those early stresses in childhood tend to repeat throughout life. So it sets up that like pattern, which looks like fate. Actually, it's not fate, because you can undo it. But that's where energy healing takes you, okay? But it takes you there with a holistic approach to health and healing. So the healing arts are like preventive, and they're restorative as well as adjunct. That's to say, they don't replace allopathic medicine. You should never discount allopathic medicine, but the ideal is never to need it. Okay, that's kind of where we're trying to position energy healing now. So we want to empower you to be far more apt at restoring yourself and preventing, for instance, getting ill in the first case, which is always better than getting ill and trying to recover. And so, the kind of nexus for this is emotional healing, okay? So emotional issues are key determinants of our overall well-being, but lifestyle factors are key determinants of our overall health, okay? And I said coming into this, we need to have a holistic perspective. So both factors, emotional and lifestyle, are intimately connected. And our lifestyle is often compensatory for our emotional issues, okay? When we dwell on ourselves, we begin to realize just how those two play off each other. And our ill health arises largely from lifestyle issues. It's what we eat, what we drink, what we don't do, or what we do. So when we come to consider energy healing, we need to operate from a realistic view of our lifestyle, our diet, drink, exercise, sense of fulfillment from what we do each day, and our sense of purpose, okay? You need to make a list of those things and just, what am I actually doing on each of those headings, The toxicity of like alcohol, of sugar, of dairy, of so many things is absolutely enormous. And it can be a major, headache to try and sort out those basic things, to have a sustainable diet, something that you can keep going, which is not toxic. It takes a bit of work. But that's where I would say everyone, all of us, myself included, that's where we need to have like constant vigilance over on that area, because that toxicity is going to undermine your energy body as well. And when your energy body is undermined, it undermines the quality of depth of awareness that you can access. Okay. So, it's dominoes again, So if you decide that real change is something that you want to engage in, you'll need to decide which elements of your current lifestyle you're prepared to change to achieve a higher level of well-being. So it's not just a question of jumping on a technique like emotional freedom techniques, doing some rounds of tapping and then dropping it again. You need to think about where you are in life. Are you where you want to be? Your sense of fulfillment is so important. Toxicity, what your goals are. For most people, there are one or two emotional issues that stand out. Like if you think of a forest, you're like a forest of emotional issues. And then in that forest, there's like 2 or 3 trees that really stand out. It might be a recurrent anger that you can't control, an anxiety, fear, or jealousy, whatever it is, doesn't matter. If you can target those couple of really large trees and hack them down, the rest is going to be dead easy. Hacking those 2 or 3 emotional trees that really stand out in your experience can be difficult. But we would always recommend get a coaching assistance with this. Somebody who's good professional working with these energy techniques. If you can target specific emotional issues that really mess up your day-to-day life and chop them down, it's going to change everything. It's going to change the way you relate to reality, the way people relate to you. It's going to change the way your needs for instance, junk food or drink, all of a sudden it's going to shake up everything. So there would be one recommendation. Target those.
That is huge.
Yeah. If possible, do it with a facilitator who also trains you in the technique. That's something we always do. We always say, do the training. We'll chop the trees down, but get empowered. Empower yourself to take charge. Okay. I want to say something now a bit about the techniques. Not all techniques suit everyone. This may sound obvious, but okay. For convenience, we can separate the techniques into 2 broad classes of energy techniques, what I call directed techniques and blanket techniques. Directed techniques are directed to a specific emotional disturbance. Blanket techniques address the entire energy body. Okay. The reason for the separation is not everybody is comfortable or able to identify specific emotional issues and articulate them for a directed technique to then chop them down. Okay. If you are comfortable, you have that kind of awareness and you're comfortable with it, you want to get rid of it, then a directed energy technique, EFT, mind connection healing, any of them, it's going to eliminate that emotional issue within the space. Normally what we're seeing, especially with Kenzie, who's a real expert, 90% success rate in one session. That session may be like 2 hours, but it'll be fixed. Okay. Blanket techniques work by raising the overall level of energy in the body. And when you do that, that tends to allow background emotional disturbances to emerge from the field. So you become aware of them in some part of your body or emotionally. So it allows you to connect without having to talk about it, without having to articulate it. Okay. We're going to let the energy do the work with a blanket technique. Okay. So Usui Reiki, which, you know, I've been doing like 25 years now, is a gentle blanket technique. Okay. Rebirthing breathwork, on the other hand, is a really intense blanket technique. Okay. Perhaps I should explain that a little. Okay, Usui Reiki is hands-on healing. Hands-on healing has been practiced worldwide. I mean, throughout like Middle East, Central Asia, right across China to Japan for thousands of years. Okay, so Usui Reiki is just one variant. The beauty of it is that we have a lineage. So we know what's getting served up. There's a lot of things out there which call themselves Reiki today. I hear good things about them. I just don't know what the lineage is, what the source of the energy is. But with the Usui Reiki, I know exactly the lineage and I know what's served up. It's always good. It's always enough to start the process of cleansing. It's never too much. That's important. It's never overwhelming. Whereas, for instance, I tried Kundalini Reiki once, and really it didn't do me any good at all. Anything with Kundalini as part of the name of it, just leave it. So yeah, Usui Reiki, gentle hands-on healing technique, and that's one way to go. Again, you empower yourself. You don't just get Reiki. You know, get initiated, first degree or second degree, certainly, always second degree Reiki, Usui Reiki, and start healing yourself. If you do get Reiki, for the first 10 days, 2 weeks, treat yourself every single day, at least twice, like in the morning before you get up and at night. Treat your dog, your cat, your partner, stray dogs on the street, whatever. Use the energy like hell for those first 10 days, and that will start a cleanse and detox your energy body, and you're going to start feeling the energy really strong in your hands. And when you do, you will have the confidence to then go and start doing healing to yourself and others, and you become a part of that community. Okay. So a lot of people just get Reiki and say, oh, I didn't feel much, and so they give it up, you know. No, you have to cultivate it. Energy work requires cultivation. It's not an on-off switch. And the Usui Reiki is spiritually directed energy. So it's not bioenergy. It's not therapeutic touch. And what I mean by that is you're not using your own energy with the Usui Reiki. You're channeling a higher order, spiritual body of beings energy. Okay. So all you're doing is putting yourself forward. You have no involvement in the outcome. You know, you have to have that sense of non-engagement in the result. It's not your result. Your part in it is putting yourself forward to help. What happens is out of your control. I've had some remarkable things happen with Usui Reiki. Very early on, we went to treat this elderly doctor. She's retired. She had had a stroke. She was seized up in bed. I started treating her arm, and after about half an hour, it opened, and she could use her hand again. Okay. So it's not me. I just putting myself there, allowing the energy to do the work. So Usui Reiki is as close as you can get to third G without all the ritual as it's possible to get. You connect through your alignment with this community, ethical, healing stream of consciousness and become part of it. So it lifts you up as well. And in this connection, I want to say one other thing, that a lot of our problems are to do with the small I, or persona. When you do this stuff, you shift from the small I to we. Okay, you enter the fundamental state of leadership. And all of a sudden, the persona is not such a big player in your day-to-day sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. And just my personal reflection on that point is the persona is too small a vehicle to provide meaning in life in any case. Okay, so if you're relying on that to fill in your sense of purpose and meaning, you're on a loser with that. Okay, so when you step into the broader community and I to we and what you can do, that's when you generate meaning, because meaning isn't there to be found. It's what you produce through your engagement. Okay. So ability or willingness to articulate emotional issues may be an important factor for you in choosing the techniques you work with, as, for instance, is the issue of intensity. So, not everybody is into intensity. Whenever I was facilitating rebirthing breathwork, I tried to contain the intensity of the process so as not to cause, a re-traumatization, it's called. In the early days of rebirthing, they just went hell for leather, and that's fine. You get enormous breakthroughs, but after about 10 sessions, you become averse to it. Okay, so, you need to be a little careful with intensity and find facilitators who are aware of this. And in general, you need to find facilitators you can relate to, always. Your personal and spiritual development journey shouldn't be another trial. We have enough trials in day-to-day life, It should be fun. It should be, your escape from all of that stuff into a pure world. I'm not sure I have much more to say about this. I think that was it on that topic, Alex. I went on long enough in any case, I guess.
Peter, I know I join the listeners in thanking you for sharing all of those amazing insights and tips, because they really recalibrate, at least for me when I was reading the book and hearing you now, really challenging us to re-examine long-held patterns, habits, ways of perceiving, clinging on to the I instead of focusing on the we. I mean, those are excellent. In fact, Peter, we have so many listener questions for you, and I can't think of a better way to transition to some of those. We have another listener question for you, Peter, from Lydia, who is saying, "Hello, Peter. I'm so happy to be able to submit questions and listen to your insights. I've been working with Usui Reiki for a while now, and I've been initiated for the moment to master level. My interest in deeper spirituality and esotericism began about 7 years ago, and I firstly turned my gaze and attention to Wicca. But as time progressed, I realized I wasn't comfortable, nor did I see the relevance in terms of spiritual ascension, as it were, in concentrating uniquely on one set school of thought or intellectual movement. I therefore," Lydia says, "have been branching out to various axes, including Reiki, shamanism, Buddhism, the monotheistic belief systems, and more recently, Christian mysticism, to name a few. And as research pursued, this point of questioning flourished. Could it be said," Lydia asks you, Peter, "do you think that the variety of spiritual paths or ideas or traditions that we observe throughout history and across diverse cultures are in fact a manifestation of wanting to be akin to divinity, and that this pure invisible source that we wish to access is in fact universal for all of us in its essence, i.e. the concept of gnosis could be a universal concept, but the manifestation or the representations differ from person to person?" Lydia says, "I would love to know your take on that, Peter, and thank you so much."
Wow, what a question. Okay, thanks for that, Lydia. Let's have a go at that. I talked about the field as the best way to describe the field is panpsychism, right? So panpsychism states that there's energy and there's consciousness, and that these are two aspects, the two sides of the same coin. Okay, and that sets it up kind of metaphysically, and that is borne out by the various like constellation therapy and the other therapies we discussed. Okay, so panpsychism is basically true description of how, as an energy healer, you experience reality. But beyond it, it fails to really draw out key notions, agency, value, meaning. Okay, and for that, we need to move towards animism, which is the recognition of an essential and shared personhood with all sentient life. Okay. And that is the immanence of the divine in everything, in all times and all places. So we can think of it as divinity looks out upon the world in wonder through so many different eyes. Okay. So the stumbling block that confronts us is the limitation to the quality of our own present moment awareness. Okay, it's not something inherent in reality. It's inherent in the toxicities and emotional toxicities that we carry. That's what separates us from divine wonder, in which we participate because it is immanent in everything, every moment. And I hope that is kind of an answer to the question you were asking, Lydia.
That is lovely, Peter, and I'm sure I join Lydia in thanking you for that. And Peter, too, we have a few anonymous questions for you and some context around these. So we have a first listener question from Anonymous saying, in the book, Peter Mark Adams comments on having trained conventional Western medical practitioners to incorporate the healing field into their regular practice. I would be curious, Anonymous says, to know if Mr. Adams might be able to comment further or elaborate on the outcomes achieved by these practitioners.
Not really possible. I mean, these people often come for healing, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, doctors, they come for healing and then end up taking training with us. And then they go off about their own lives. So, we had, I think there's a case in the book actually of a doctor who treated Kenzie's mother. Okay. And this was the blood platelets. And after they went up to a certain level, which was absolutely incredible, he couldn't account for it. She said, well, I'm doing Reiki, she said. He said, whatever you're doing, please continue. We only later heard that he had also now been initiated to Reiki and was practicing it. So it's not as though we're operating in a kind of scientific institute way. We had an office. Unfortunately, we closed it down because of the pandemic, as so many people had to do, 2 years ago. So like the organizational nexus for our work has shifted now to the internet. And our main job, at the moment, mine is primarily working as an author and Kenzie as a trainer and one-on-one healer. Okay. So we're not really in a position of like chasing individuals to see, how are they getting on with the technique. As I say, they came with an issue. The issue was solved. Then they saw training and went back to life, And in general, I think the crossover between energy healing techniques and the healing professions is far more intense than we might think. For instance, we had a group of, I think, 15 psychotherapists who, as a group, requested training in, I think it was EFT. So we delivered that to them, and then they go back into their professional life. A lot of them we hear later are delivering training themselves in EFT as well as using it in their therapy. But we're not set up to like track. I think we have like 5,000 cases on our files, and at one point certainly Kenzie was dealing with 3 people a day, 4 people a day.
Wow.
Just going through the healing one after the other, So it's unfortunately, I can't really answer that. I would direct people to ACEP if they're interested. That's the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology. It's International Association of Healing Professionals. So it includes energy healers, carers, and psychotherapists, very largely organized around EFT. And so that is an association of such professionals. That's one. And they may want to check out, for instance, Reiki.org, which is William Rand's Reiki site in the US. Certainly, I got initiated by William Rand, so I have that lineage through him back to Mikao Usui, to the original Reiki Kokai over in Japan. But on his site, he had a project, Reiki in Hospitals. And there was a time when most of the top hospitals, certainly in the US, had Reiki as adjunct therapy. Very famous cardiologist, Dr. Memedos, pioneered this minimal opening of the chest to do heart surgery. His wife is a Reiki teacher. And he incorporates Reiki in his cardiology and certainly post-operative recovery. And there are some recent studies. I can let you have these later if you wish, Alex, relating to the effectiveness of Reiki in recovery, in pain management, and so on. I think there was a study published like 2 weeks ago. There's certainly over 100 papers now, clinical trials of EFT done, and at least 4 meta-analyses, that's to say analyses of these trials. So there's a formidable crossover going on in the background and has been for many years.
Well, Peter, I think this leads to the second question that Anonymous had for you, which is, Peter, I am a medical oncologist, and I have no doubt about the truth of the claims and the anecdotes related in the book, largely because I've experienced such types of healing phenomena frequently. But I have a sense that I'm in the minority amongst my peers. I appreciate your focus, Peter, on scientific rigor with regards to this topic. And I wonder, Anonymous is asking, if you, Peter, have conceptualized any scientific experiments that might be sufficient to gain traction for these phenomena within the mainstream of materialist biomedicine. As an aside, I would be very interested, Anonymous says, to work with you on such a project if you are interested.
Yeah, unfortunately, as I say, we just don't have the organizational nexus for something like that, You're very much isolated here. I say Kenzie is doing one-on-one and training online. She would be interested in talking to you about research. She's kind of the center of a network, so she's aware of a lot more than I am. So if you would wish to contact her through mindconnectionhealing.com, please do. And but I can't really say anything positive about this. We don't have anything going on in terms of research ourselves. We don't have the facilities or organization for that, unfortunately. It's not really, not really something we can do.
Well, and what's so great about the work that you and Kenzie do, among many other things, is that, as you mentioned, during the pandemic, you've shifted to online, you've adapted, and yet still helping people every day, which is so wonderful. And Peter, I think this kind of, talking about the themes about self-empowerment, defending your time, defending your attention and not letting it, distracted and bogged down. We have another listener question for you from Durag Mason. And Durag is asking and saying, I just finished the book yesterday, and I was struck how it had a gently yet firmly repackaged energy healing away from the New Age tropes healing tends to be associated with. Most notably in the end chapter, when Peter lists out the areas where one must make life changes, be disciplined, live with integrity, and notably remove distractions from one's life when he focuses on social media, which I wholeheartedly agree with. The book reminds me in a lot of ways of Josephine McCarthy's Exorcist's Handbook. To build on a previous question from Douglas about energy, Durag's asking, Peter, what can those involved in magic learn from energy healers in terms of being in good relation with the self, the family, and the community? And you touched on that, but in anything from a magical perspective in terms of coming at it from that angle?
Well, I say the touchstone for me is that diagram of the shamanic community engagement. That for me is a touchstone. It allows me to reorientate my thinking because we're so often distracted by stuff on media, which it's directed towards gaining attention. It has a lot to do with lifestyles and not to do with community engagement. So all I can say really is that people should study that diagram and think about how their personal practice does or does not engage with some of the points over there. And you can't kind of prescribe for people. So people have got to decide whether living in their head or living in a state of ongoing ethical community engagement is the priority in their lives at this time. Okay, it's that fundamental an issue, and the situation in the world is that fundamentally dangerous at this time, environmentally, politically, socially. There's so much division, so much anger, and we're living in a very, very fraught period. So the pandemic kind of layering on top of that has for many people been an enormous challenge. The isolation and the fear. So yeah, there are fundamental decisions that we all have to take in how we orient or reorientate ourselves to the present reality. I hope that with the comments I gave earlier to Douglas's question kind of address what Dara was talking about.
Absolutely. And when it comes to this concept of recoding and healing locally and non-locally, but tapping into that, the themes of language come up a lot, and coding, and what does it mean to recode something and do it ethically. And we have another listener question for you, Peter, along those lines about language from Duncan Keegan. And Duncan is saying, I'm really excited for this. Game of Saturn has been pride of place on my creaking bookshelves. Me too, Duncan. It's fantastic. Duncan says, I do have a question I'd be interested in hearing Peter's response to, but the preamble is a bit long. Apologies. But he says, as an Irish person, I look at the higher than average rates for mental health illness amongst Irish, both present day and historically, patterns of substance abuse, manic behavior visible in versions of the stage Irishman. And I can't help thinking of these as symptoms at a society level of our traumatic history of conquest and colonization, signs of what we might say is a soul loss. Now, history is complex. There's always more than one kind of harm and trauma at play, but one I have a particular interest in is the impact of a forced shift from one language to another, in this case, from Irish to English, and how that might have what impact that might have on a person's sense of self and wholeness and separation from a sense of belonging, both to a natural community and one's immediate environment, either through forced emigration or the imposed Anglicization of place names and social relations. So here's the question. given the profound impact it may have on our well-being and sense of wholeness, I'd love to hear Peter's view on what language is. What is this extraordinary faculty that we humans have that exists in such diversity of form around the world, that is partly material, partly immaterial, that allows us to evoke feelings, images, and a sense of meaning in others' hearts and minds through the creation of physically audible sounds, and that can be used to call into visible appearance immaterial spiritual creatures. What is this faculty of language, Peter, and what role does it play in the healing modalities that you explore in the book?
Yeah, wow. Let me preface that with a very short passage from Gordon White's recent work, Animistic. Okay. And in that, I know this because I wrote the review of it on Paralibro. Okay, so in there he wrote, language begins in poetry and ends in prose. It is a process of losing the life in it over time, and that today we have to strive to experience or convey that aliveness in language through poetry, for instance, where our ancestors did so effortlessly. Old languages did not aim to convey aliveness, they just did. And I think, the poet in me responds to that, but the difficulty is reconstituting poetic speech. It's a reconstitution which is not only of the language that we employ, of developing, so to speak, a tangential vocabulary, but of reconstituting our entire perceptual apparatus, our way of being in the world. And for me, that is the chief difficulty in writing poetry, is that, okay, which is very much akin to the kinds of shifts in the quality and depth of awareness that we talked about earlier. So that language then becomes the measure and expression of how deep the reformation of our being has become. So, for these reasons, and by the way, I'm a great fan, for instance, of Seamus Heaney's North. It was a book I purchased on the day it was published and has stayed on my shelf ever since, simply because of the magic. And more recently, I reviewed Richard Skelton's Stranger in the Mask of a Deer, along with Autumn Richardson's works. They're all on Paralibrum, and they're all about the way in which language allows us to re-access a far more primordial connection with nature. Okay, so these poets have succeeded through language in doing that, but it's been an extraordinary skill and sensitivity to achieve that. So I would strongly recommend anyone check out those reviews, and if they should feel moved by them, to check out the original poetry. So I think with the employment of these enriched poetic languages, we acknowledge a rupture with the past. And in a way, we seek to atone for past pain through our empathic engagement and recognition of past trauma and separation. So the poeticization of that suffering, so to speak, assuages the ancestral line.
That is fascinating. Yes. Healing and engaging directly with the ancestral line. Actually, that, Peter, when you talk about ancestors like that, and when you talk about, again, these non-local states over space and time, and tapping into that, we do have a listener question for you about ancestors and techniques with ancestors from Delaney. And Delaney is asking, Peter, what are some methods other than dumb suppers and masses said to enlighten ancestors? Anything that you can share about techniques or just ways of engaging that maybe we haven't discussed yet?
I'd strongly recommend reading Gordon White's Animistic. The reason is that in that book, Gordon kind of tours Australasia, talking, there's a strong presence of indigenous voices and practices that he has captured in that book. And it addresses directly the question you're putting: how do we re-engage with the ancestors? How do we resolve past trauma? Because places like, Tasmania, of course, and Australia itself were subject to some horrendous colonial practices of expropriation and ethnic cleansing and the attempt to obliterate ancient, archaic cultures. And kind of the echoes of those traumas continue today in the forests and the fields and the plains. So that, there's a great quote from William Faulkner, the past is never dead, it's not even past. The larger field of consciousness, because of its nature, holds these ripples, these distortions. And as we know from, for instance, Rupert Sheldrake, the field is not just a passive field. It generates effects. So he calls it morphic resonance. It actually generates an effect in the here and now. So that the ability to empathically engage with ancestral thought, feeling, to understand what would be an appropriate response to what has happened in the past, and then to enact it cooperatively with the dead ancestors, is a task. But it is a task which the indigenous peoples in Australasia are kind of daily engaged with. And that's the beauty of Animistic, actually, because it really puts you in frame. And in that book, some of the most sensitive voices in this area are beautifully reflected. So that for me would be the first, stopping place. Go there, check it out, check the references out that Gordon White has dug out. And then start thinking through. There's one story really affected me. I think it's one of the early stories in the book. An indigenous tribesperson wanted to restore an ancient hill fort, which was also a sacred place on the hillside. So for 6 months, he sat and contemplated. He didn't contemplate the economics of it. He didn't contemplate the logistics or the practicality. He entered a deeply contemplative conversation with the spirits of place and with the ancestors. And he sat there for 6 months, engaged in this process of listening, empathic, psychic, intuitive listening, to understand how he should go about this process in a way that acknowledged the ancestors and the sacrality of place and the spirits of place. Okay, it's an amazing story. But it's just one of many which Gordon has captured in that book. So I hope that inspires people who are thinking through these issues, to go look and see what's being done currently and to follow up on it. It's really important work, and it is definitely energy healing work, but it's bigger. It's something far bigger and on a far bigger scale, of course.
Well, that sounds like an absolutely wonderful book, and the way that you're sharing that Gordon presents that and talks about it and the just incredible information sounds excellent. So we'll certainly make sure to link to that, Peter. And
let me just,
yes,
for anyone who's interested, let me just,
there it is on the bookshelf. Excellent.
Yeah, Animistic. And it's absolutely gorgeous production from Scarlet Imprint, which always the case.
Well, with Scarlet Imprint, that's exactly what one can expect, right? Just amazing,
Absolutely.
high quality work, and yes, always, never
so
a surprise.
There. Small plug for Gordon's book.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That is so excellent. And Peter, speaking of, I definitely want to chat with you just very briefly about, where people can find your book, and also perhaps just generally talking about some upcoming projects or whatever you're working on. But we do have one last listener question/comment for you, and I'm curious, your thoughts on this. It's approaching healing from discussing the techniques, and this is from Mickle J. And Mickle is asking, as a student of Gary Craig, EFT, and now named Optimal EFT for over 2 decades, it's been over a decade since he has led with any sort of tapping modality. During the Rune Soup podcast, speaking of Gordon White, this seems to be left as a gray area. If I caught this, others will too. There is no or very little tapping encouraged. It is now version 2.0, where the assumption is made that it is the Holy Spirit, aka an unseen therapist, that does the healing work through the evocation of love. One could also name this the field. I still practice, Mickle says, the strategic method from 20 years ago by focusing on the trauma, but only briefly. The remainder of the time during the session is then refocused to the evocation of love through a memory or an imagined one of joy. Personally, I've found this as successful and perhaps more than the tapping approach. Cheers. And I guess, Peter, just what are your thoughts on that? And when you said earlier that you kind of you kind of put yourself in a position and you allow this healing to take place, is that similar to what Mickle's saying regarding the evocation of love, or just would love your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I only mentioned Gary Craig, EFT, and tapping because that's how EFT got started. I could equally have mentioned the work of Roger Callahan, who developed thought field therapy. And thought field therapy, which is still practiced today, is the father of EFT. EFT is a simplified form of thought field therapy. And of course, for a lot of people, EFT still means tapping, or there's, for instance, ASEP. I mentioned them earlier, the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology. And there's also various flavors of EFT out there. Faster EFT, this guy R.G. Smith, or the Guild of Energists, Sylvia Hartman, EFT, tapping therapy EFT, Jack Canfield, the soup guy, the tapping solution, Nick Ortner, Joe Merkler, and Dawson Church, and almost every country has its flavor, its particular flavor of EFT, which has some mixture of tapping or not tapping. So I'm not in the, I acknowledge optimal EFT is what Gary Craig is doing right now, and that it involves some kind of bringing in a higher force to do it. 2 points. One, first, that classical EFT is still promoted on his site. It's called Gold Standard EFT. Secondly, not everybody would be comfortable with the thought of bringing in higher powers. And I alluded to this earlier when I said that tapping EFT is still the fastest, easiest, most accomplished way of getting into energy healing that I know. So because it has that kinetic element, you tap something, it gives you something to do, so to speak. Even if that is redundant, it gets you started. and it gives you a process. You have a recipe, okay? You follow the recipe and it works. And that's what builds the confidence for you to then begin to explore, like surrogate tapping on behalf of somebody else, and then distance tapping, and then just imagining you're tapping, and then you're on your way to beginning to work with the field on the level of the field, okay? But not everybody is ready to just jump in at that level, okay? So classic EFT is a wonderful entry into the big field of energy healing. And that's why I still say, okay, Gary Craig has so to speak, superseded tapping EFT in his own practice. That's fine, but it's not for everybody. Tapping EFT is still universally practiced, and there's a good reason why. That's all I'm saying. It's a great way of starting. In our own practice, for instance, we're using mind connection healing. And what Kenzie does with that is she has formulated a healing protocol. In a meditative state, you internalize that in your energy field, and then whenever you want to heal, you simply trigger it. So you're using you're leveraging the field to clear the field. Okay, so that's, tapping EFT leads you in the direction of working directly with the field, and there's different ways. Optimal EFT, mind connection healing, and probably a lot of other ways are out there, because everybody is evolving along the same lines. Okay, we're starting with tapping and then getting more abstracted, more global, more universal in our outlook. Anyway, I hope that kind of answers or contextualizes what I was trying to say there a little better.
Absolutely. And again, Peter, your entire book, this really is putting into context, especially now, but it's timeless as well, but especially now where there's so many different forces and global challenges and political challenges and everything that's going on right now. It is so important to empower ourselves. And so we will make sure listeners check out the video description and the podcast description for links on where you can pick up your own copy of Peter's book. And Peter, too, you mentioned the amazing work, obviously, that you and Kenzie have done for years. Can you share with listeners a little bit about where they can find out more information about the work that you and Kenzie do, and where they can check out, if not some of your services, just some of the information that you'd like people to know about?
Yeah, mindconnectionhealing.com, that everything is there. Get in touch with Kenzie. If you're, maybe you've got emotional issues you're interested in, can she resolve them? 2 or 3 sentences and check it out. She's running training. She's doing one-on-ones. She's doing a lot of work with people from the US at the moment. And that's an open door to everybody, Empower yourself, get empowered to heal yourself, heal your family, heal in your community. So that's the most obvious. And apart from that, get the book, because the book has everything. It's a quarter of a century of experience and knowledge are in that book,
Yeah, it was amazing to read. I mean, story after documented case. It's just so wonderful that you and Kenzie both are sharing this with the world, and actually having people take a look at it and go, wow, here are some actual ways, not just pure techniques, but here are ways that I can integrate into the collective field, into service, stepping into service, which I know for you, Peter, is one of the themes that you've touched on so many times before. So that is just, that is so wonderful. And we cannot.
It's the ultimate tonic.
Indeed. Well, you certainly are a fully tonicked gentleman, if I may say that, and certainly an inspiration. And so we will certainly make
so much, Alex.
Definitely, Peter.
I'm blushing.
Well, it is certainly the honor is certainly mine, Peter, and I know with the listeners as well. And please make sure to check out, listeners, the podcast description, the video description for all of the links that you can check out Peter's work. Just, Peter, as we wrap up just this main part of the podcast, is there just anything else that you would like to share with listeners, or anything else that you'd like to leave listeners with today?
Not on this topic. I think I've said enough. I noticed that Scarlet Imprint now have a page up called Forthcoming. on their website. And my new book is featured over there to be published this summer. It's called Hagia Sophia, Sanctum of Kronos. And its subtitle is Spiritual Descent in an Age of Tyranny. So what I'm doing in that book is examining the last of the great mystery cults, the rites of Eleusis, and how they were closed down at the end of the 4th century and the sanctuary was sacked, and what happened to the initiatory lineage of Eleusis. And I follow it through Athens to Alexandria to Constantinople and the builders of the Hagia Sophia, who are metaphysically directly connected to that lineage and embodied its metaphysical and spiritual outlook in the building's architecture. And I hope for the first time since that building was built, I can articulate exactly the metaphysics that they sought to capture in its architecture.
Well, thank you, Peter. Now you've tantalized everybody who's listening, including myself, not only to pick up a copy of your Healing Field book, but now so many questions on that. But we will keep our ear to the ground. We thank you so much for sharing a little bit about that, which is awesome. And by the way, you've spent years on this, right? I mean, researching, visiting, living in Turkey. I mean, you've really there's so much context that you're going to provide people.
Yeah, it's like 30 years and it's almost daily in sight, the building, I literally go outside and it's over there, So yeah, I got very, very closely engaged with its fabric and its structure and its decorative. Normally it's described as aniconic, that's to say, it doesn't have a decorative scheme applied to it. But I've decoded the decorative scheme. There is one, and I've decoded it, just as I kind of decoded the mysteries in Pompeii or the Solarbuska cards. It was a similar exercise of patiently looking for clues and then trying to understand their significance in terms of this great tradition of Hellenistic metaphysics towards states of non-dual awareness, which is the goal of theurgy. Okay. The decorative scheme fully realizes that. And I hope I can demonstrate that to you.
Well, I know I join many listeners, Peter, in saying that we very much look forward to your forthcoming book with Scarlet Imprint. That sounds excellent. Author, poet, essayist, professional energy worker, specializing in the ethnography and visuality of ritual and the history of art, among so many other things. And together with his wife and healer and life partner, Kenzie, their new book is The Power of the Healing Field. Peter Mark Adams. Peter, thank you as always, just so much just for taking the time and sharing your time and wisdom on the podcast today. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and your audience. So anytime.